It is Click and Clack here again to help you out. Dr. Kuhn will be back with us tomorrow. Let's see, do you want to go?
I was just going to say welcome to another day. Thank you all for another very good round of questions. And I see that a couple of you had emailed me your questions, and I will make sure those get counted. And I will turn it over to the esteemed Dr. Starks, our medical humanitarian, to introduce our esteemed guest medical humanitarian.
I am so pleased that you are able to join us this morning to listen to Dr. Micah Hester, who is the he is the king of bioethics and medical humanities here in the Arkansas area. He has put together a massive group of medical humanists across the state. From his kind of standpoint there as professor of medical humanities and bioethics and professor of pediatrics in the College of Medicine at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences. He is dressed up today because he is about to go and help out a whole bunch of students as they graduate from UAMS. So I know that some of you are pre-med. We also have, of course, engineers, psychiatry, even English, right?
We have English, we have economics, we have, let's see, we already said engineering, we have pre-nursing, we have pre-physical
physical therapy.
Physical or occupational, I've forgotten. We have a great range of people in health professions and also in the humanities out there, anthropology.
So Professor Hester has given you some stuff to think about as he presents today. He is well storied and perhaps our most qualified in bioethics that we will have in any way in this course. He has written on end-of-life care and programmatic decision-making, and we'll be talking about that tomorrow, about assisted suicide. He's also written on community as healing, guidance for healthcare ethics, and has a textbook out there also on ethics by committee, a textbook on consultation, organization, and education. He is here to help you. He is very interested in chatting with you. Please go ahead and put questions into the chat, and he will incorporate those as he goes through. But I am just so very excited because I have dealt with Professor Hester as a colleague. I haven't gotten to see him teach, and I know that you are going to enjoy it as much as I am because I just learned so much of just talking with him. Can't imagine what I'm going to get today as I listen to him present. So thank you so much, Comrade Hester, for joining us, and greetings from Bioethics.
Well, thank you so much, and I will disappoint all around, I'm sure. But I will do the best I can, I promise. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Look, as Dr. Starr said, I would love to have this as, as interactive as is comfortable for all of you, because otherwise an hour and a half of me just blathering at you, well, that would even bore me, quite frankly, and so you don't want that. Excuse me while I just make sure that I call up things so I can see the chat as it's going, and I think I am ready to go. As the introduction said, my job in life is to work on the areas of medical humanities and bioethics, clinical ethics, medical ethics, research ethics, nursing ethics, and those things at a health sciences institution, UAMS. And I'm a philosopher by training and have only ever worked full-time in medical schools. So those of you who are doing, interesting undergraduate degrees, don't think that they lock you into only one path in life. In fact, there are many different ways to get to different aspects of a career and a trajectory in your career path. So take advantage of that. I'll just put in that plug right up front. Today, I've been asked to talk about issues in transgender care, and in particular, I'll focus on children, though there are issues in adult care that also matter. We'll go through this, and again, please ask questions or provide comments in the chat as we go. I will try to stop along the way. there's no need for us to kind of be so beholden to the structure of slides that we can't stop and chat as we go through. Of course, after we do all this and take our break, we'll still have another hour to be able to have some discussion on all of this as well. Well, these are objectives. You can ignore those because who knows if I even meet them. It doesn't matter. While I'm going through this, always have to give disclosures. It's always good to disclose who you are and where you're coming from. The reality is that I know that I have my own stature and status in life, much of it being based on certainly things that I didn't do. But also, as we talk through this, I'm not a lawyer. Any legal statements I make are my own interpretations of things, but they do not constitute any legal advice or true acceptable legal interpretations. And otherwise, of course, just, know my bosses like it when I do this kind of work. I don't know if you all know this movie. Heck, given your ages, it's quite possible it came out before most of you were born. Pleasantville is an interesting movie. It's actually hard right now to find on the streaming services. It's an interesting movie, and I think it brings into stark relief some issues that come up in relationship to questions of transgender care. I mean, actually brings up issues that come up in all sorts of ways, and that's part of what we'll talk about. So there's a foundational myth. Say I'm an old guy, and when I was growing up in the late 60s and early 70s, television had 5 or 6 or maybe 8 channels, depending on where you lived in the country. And the time was filled on some of those non-network channels with old reruns of 1950s shows. Those 1950s shows were often, always in black and white. And a lot of them portrayed what we might call a foundational myth, that there was this nuclear family made up of purely white individuals in a small town where houses were clean, picket fences, and well-groomed yards. Everybody had particular roles that they played, and those roles were distinct and clear. Nobody seemed to rebel against those roles. In fact, they seemed to embrace the roles that they were in. And the movie Pleasantville plays off of this. In fact, what it does is it's the story of a boy who's in the 1990s, his parents have divorced, and he is clearly feels a bit of an outsider in his life in high school. And what he does to kind of escape the stresses of his family life and his high school existence is to get invested in these old rerun television shows of the 1950s. And the show he's most interested in is a show called Pleasantville, talking about, again, this stereotypical world in which everything is black and white, and all the characters enjoy their positions in life, and everything comes out with a nice moral in the end, and those kinds of things. Well, he gets invested in that, and one day they're going to have a contest where in the contest, if you can answer questions about Pleasantville, they're doing a Pleasantville marathon on television. If you can answer the questions, you get a certain prize that he wants to win. And so he sits down to watch the marathon in order to get through this marathon and hopefully take the quizzes, win the prize. However, his TV breaks, and in the TV breaking, a kind of mysterious man comes who's a TV repair person who gives him a special remote. And when he clicks the remote, he gets sucked in to Pleasantville itself. But what also happens is that his sister, who's more rebellious, more adventuresome, more popular, thinks he's a dork, is fighting with him at the same time, and she gets sucked in as well. And so we see Tobey Maguire and Reese Witherspoon playing these main character kids get sucked into the show, and they become characters who already exist in the show, the main two children in this family in Pleasantville. Right? You've got beautiful family with, perfect breakfast every morning. There's plenty of food, and everyone loves everything that's going on. And again, the roles are very black and white. What some call traditional, we might actually say out of date and mythological roles of gender roles are all played out. Well, what happens is, because they've now been infused with the 1990s people who recognize who they are, they don't lose their consciousness. They are conscious of their 1990s self, but they know they have to play this role in this show in order to figure out how to get back home, as it were. Because of all that, things start to change, and the changes happen really around the metaphor of sex, quite frankly, such that as people start to discover themselves and and start to free themselves from the black and white mythology, color is introduced into their world. In fact, the wife, the mother in the show, she's long been in love, had a crush on the owner of the diner malt shop in town. But she's never been able to act on it because, of course, that's not her role in life. But now that this element has been introduced into the world, she's able to act on it. But what that means is that she becomes colorized. And that, of course, undoes her in many ways, because that's not who she's understood herself to be. And it becomes a quite difficult transition for her to figure out. And she, in fact, tries to get makeup and paper over all of this in some way, shape, or form. Eventually, however, she has to come to grips with this is who she is. Her husband, right, is freaked out by this. Nobody really knows the source of this, because they don't realize that these two kids are actually not the real, not the characters in the show, but are real people from the 1990s. Nobody's like, her husband says, "Oh my God, you're right, you're different now, and that's wrong, and that's a problem, and so it has to go away. Don't worry, it will go away." And she comes to realize that maybe that's not how she wants life to be, that in fact, she doesn't want it to go away, that she's starting to discover who she really is. Of course, this then leads to not just a problem within the family, but a problem within the entire community of Pleasantville, right? And you have the very stereotypical, fair enough, but understandable expressions of fear coming out during this time, and the head of the town being concerned, and a big town hall meeting happening, and the statement is, right, this behavior has to stop at once. It's ruining, right? It's ruining our town. It's changing who we are in a bad, evil way. And Tobey Maguire's character says, "But see, this is just the point. It can't stop at once, because it's in you, and you can't stop something that's inside you." Well, all of this really eventually there's a moment when the town finally recognizes and realizes this is the case, and it eventually all becomes colorized, and the world turns from its black and white universe into a colorized existence. Well, I mean, I think it's fairly obvious terms of how this applies to our discussions today. But I think it's important to see that how pervasive the myth is and what happens when myths get challenged, especially when those myths are experienced by human beings as being the truth. If we've experienced something as being a truth and it gets exposed for being myth, it's not so easy to have that knowledge and just turn on a dime and be able to change your attitudes in the world. And what we're talking about here is what I call the myth of binary, that somehow the world lends itself to and is grounded on different kinds of binary conditions, typically oppositional or at least isolatable from each other, these binaries. So this myth takes many different forms, right? We talk about fact versus value. There are facts in life, and those facts are objective and clean and stand out in the world for all to see without question or interpretation, versus value, which is subjective and is held by individuals and can be questioned at any moment. But fact isn't questionable because it is objectively true. That is a myth. That which we call fact is something infused already with values. And those things that are values are often held at least intersubjectively in order to, and which begins to look very much like what we mean by objective. Good versus evil is another one of these myths that comes up, that there is a kind of clean array of goodness and a clean but problematic array of evil. And while people themselves may be a mix of both, evil and good are clearly distinguishable and are separable things. There's no such thing as a mix of good and evil unto itself. There are goods and evils that may stand alongside each other. Free and enslaved is another version of this. What Aristotle would talked about as substance versus accident, those things that are essential and substantive to beings, to entities, versus accidents, things that aren't essential and can be changed without changing the very substance of the thing. Order and chaos, spirit and matter, mind and body. Diet Coke and Diet Pepsi are absolutely different things. I am drinking my Diet Coke. I will never touch Diet Pepsi. It's disgusting stuff. All right. But the fact is that all of these issues we talk about, and there are actually good reasons analytically to talk about them separately, but it builds on this myth that they are essentially, fundamentally separate, when in fact they're separate for analytic purposes, but in reality, it's a myth to call these binaries. And so this myth carries over when we talk about gender binary. Now, look, I know I'm talking to an audience of people whose age and whose upbringing in our society is such that this concept of gender fluidity as opposed to a gender binary is a concept you have grown up with. Even if you're not fully in agreement with it, you are at least comfortable with the idea that such a concept exists in our world and must be addressed. I can say from my own upbringing, again, in the late 60s, early 70s, that wasn't something that was ubiquitous in our culture. And so trying to come to grips with this is harder for an older generation than it is for a newer generation. Which is not to say that that the newer generation has come to grips with it, or that the older generation cannot. But you can see that this myth plays out in different ways. So you have male and female as a clear binary, men and women as a binary, boys and girls as a binary, masculine and feminine as a binary. And then you get folks saying, particularly in this debate regarding transgender individuals and sports, you get individuals who say are been longtime feminists who argue against the say the binary of masculine and feminine as a hard and fast binary, may still hold to the binary of male and female. So you see things like there are two philosophies that are clashing right now. One is the ideology of gender identity, and the other one is the idea of science and biology. The ideology of trans women, the ideology is trans women are women, but then there's the biology part of it. The ideology is not fact. It is not a fact that trans women are women. Is that right? That perpetuates, I would say, that perpetuates this myth of the binary when it comes to gender. The fact is a biological man is a biological man, a biological woman is a biological woman. A little thing called science and DNA. Well, that's only true if you value, right? This isn't fact, it's valuing, because if you value that DNA is the seat of gender, then maybe, and even that doesn't fully do it, because we know that there are people whose DNA and chromosome analysis shows us that they have XXY chromosomes. What is that? How can we have such a thing if there is this strict binary between male and female based on chromosomes? So again, we cannot talk about values, the facts, as if they are valueless. When we state something as a fact, we're already making a kind of value statement because we're trying to set that concept apart from other kinds of concepts that are subjective and debatable, whereas facts are supposedly objective and non-debatable, right? So you can get meaning of this myth as well. Okay. So why do I call this a myth? Well, first off, I call this a myth in part because however we talk about our worlds, when we talk about it from a worldview. Now, the reality is most of us don't actually think systematically, carefully, and intentionally about what it means to hold a worldview, what our worldview is, what our worldview implies. We are challenged to do that often, but we don't take up the challenge often. But we do have worldviews, even if they are less reflective than some other people might hold. And we have them because we grow up enculturated by the education, the family, the culture, the situations we have been raised in, and those experiences structure our worldviews. My particular worldview comes from some, I hope, thoughtful reflection coming from a man named William James, that in fact, the world we inhabit, and we are part of the world, not separable from it. The world we inhabit is like a stream. It runs constantly. We live out life in a kind of flow of experience, and we only stop to imagine and think through our experiences when there's some sort of irritation or bump in the road, right? So the river flows downstream and runs into a rock and must then divide and get around the rock in some way. And our own experience is that way too. We flow along fine and we bump into something. We have to stop for a moment and say, how do we work this new something into the flow of our lives? Starting from that worldview already predisposes me to the idea that there aren't foundational binaries necessarily, that those binaries come up for, again, as I've said before, for analytic purposes. There are useful reasons to make distinctions between male and female, between fact and value, and so on and so forth. But that alone doesn't mean that those distinctions are pointing to something that is unchangeable and real out in the world. They are made so that we can get through the flow of experience more easily. So again, given this worldview, I would claim there's a kind of existence of this non-binary fluidity. I think it's worth recognizing something though. To say that, I think what worries people sometimes in these situations is that to say that isn't to say that there is no, that there are no holds barred and you can just, and everything is fluid all the time. And so where would we ever be able to set upon some solid ground to do work and get through life and make practical decisions? I think in point of fact, it's worth seeing the world that we experience, not just as, say, a flowing stream, but also as, let's call it a crystalline structure. If you remember your chemistry and something, crystalline structures are these interesting kind of frameworks where electrons are kind of put together in a most lattice framework pattern. The electrons in the middle of a crystalline structure are pretty darn solid. They stay in the middle for most of the time because there are a lot of electrons around them to protect them. It's the electrons on the outside that kind of pop off and on. When some new electron comes along and hits the crystalline structure, another electron pops off the other end. Now, over time, and that's a long time, the electrons inside the middle can vibrate out to the edges, and some of them can therefore end up being popped off on the edges. But for the most part, it's what we might call a fairly conservative structure, not politically or anything like that, but it's a structure that kind of conserves itself in many ways, but it isn't static and it isn't unchanging or unchangeable. And I think we have to think about all of these aspects of our lives very much like that. So that when we talk about gender fluidity, it's not like we're saying, no, we can no longer talk about males and females, or that some aspects of what it means to be male in terms of whether it's medical care or political office or whatever, couldn't still be useful and important in various ways. But by thinking of it this way, what it does show us is that there's nothing that is necessarily permanent about that, and that there is an openness to fluidity, to change in our cultural and even biological makeup, so that this idea of fluidity can exist alongside the useful categories of, say, male and female. I hope that kind of helps give some sort of sense about what we're saying here. And you all live in this, in this universe in a way that I didn't growing up. But there's gender diversity, we know, exists in ways in public schools and in public spaces in ways that it, like I said, was not as obvious. Of course it existed in my day. I existed centuries back. The point is that it is now more a part of the culture that can be seen rather than covered up than it ever was before. So we know that this exists in such a way, and so it would be foolish to turn a blind eye to it. All right, that's a lot of setup, and I realize that's a lot of setup. And the reason I wanted to go through that setup was I wanted to be sure that you understood, A, where I was coming from, but also why it is that it is not easy for a culture to turn on a dime and be able to function comfortably with these concepts, which the concepts are actually relatively new, even if the conditions they point to are ancient, right? And so this is not an apologetic by any means. It is a way of trying to be sure that we recognize that challenges that not just individuals, transgender individuals have, but the culture around it in terms of trying to incorporate and work with these new concepts, why there are challenges in that way. Okay, now what I want to focus on then is, I want to focus on the idea of care, medical care particularly, for transgender children, for minors who identify as transgender or are struggling with the idea of transgender. And I'm going to start with the legal landscape because it sets a context. It's a context that may or may not be troubling to you, but whichever way it is, it's a context that is not easy to change. So it's not easy to change. So not that we have to live with it, but we at least have to know of its existence and struggle with how we're going to live with its existence or change it. I see a question in the chat. It says, what account do we have of transgender individuals from ancient cultures? Actually, that's a great question. So there are different histories that have been written in the last, say, 50 years about, and again, the terms used have changed in various ways over those 50 years, but we'll put it under the umbrella of transgender or gender fluid individuals. Accounts of that. We have, obviously, it's easier to account for things that are more recent because historical records are easier. So, having accounts of gender fluid individuals from the 1800s is possible in ways that getting information from ancient times is a bit more difficult. But in fact, you can see even just through the fluidity of what we would typically call gender roles and categories. Even just looking at that, we can see in ancient times that their sense of gender was very different than our sense of gender, which just shows that gender itself is fluid, or else it wouldn't change. So, for example, if you read even Plato's dialogues, you read about discussions of men's sexual habits with men as part and parcel of the course of what it meant to be a man in ancient Greece. And there was not this concept of homosexuality necessarily because it wasn't as if the discussions were such that men necessarily were in love with men and not women, or vice versa. It was the concept of those kinds of talks showed that these gender categories didn't require you to simply have sexual relations with a woman because you're a man, something like that. We also see, even in biblical texts, the roles and discussions of people who are so-called eunuchs in ancient times. and what roles they were to play, and how that mattered or didn't matter in the world. So those are some different ways. I see some other things. Coming up. Yeah, Ovid's Metamorphosis, 3 characters who change gender. That's right. So we have there are quote unquote mythologies, and I mean that from the kind of the sense of classics, right, and like Greek mythology, but they talk about these changes of gender, and again, talking about it makes it part of a cultural understanding of the possibilities, right? So learning more about the history of this is helpful in that way. My brother, who was a biblical scholar, actually wrote on some of the biblical entries of intersex and transgender individuals in biblical stuff. So there are different types of stories in the Bible that could even do that too. So again, even if we wouldn't say the individuals being spoken of in those texts would necessarily be transgender individuals, those stories alone start to undermine the myth of gender binary, and so start to open up the idea of gender fluidity in and of themselves just by looking at those stories. All right. So having said that, let's move on to the legal landscape as it stands currently. And forgive me, I clearly didn't animate this slide the way I meant to, but we will get there. So there are state-based statutes currently that have gone after medical care for transgender youths. In Arkansas, we have what's called the SAFE Act. Terrible name, I think, but politicians are good at spin. And it bans all gender-affirming care of minors and even bars referrals by clinicians to others. So even if you're now legally not allowed to provide gender-affirming care to a minor, you also cannot refer them to somebody in, say, another state who might be able to. Tennessee, for example, bans prepubescent hormone treatments for gender-affirming care. Idaho bans hormones and puberty blockers and referrals. They call it mutilation, with the possibility of a life sentence should you actually provide such things. There are many other states who've proposed further legislation. Some of these, in fact, from the time I made this slide, which was several weeks ago, some of these may have even already passed in some of these states. Others didn't pass, as you can see. And so this is now, it's just in the last few years that this has become a focus of politicians to look at the care of children who are working through their transgender identity, and they are, politicians are saying, and states are passing laws to stop what certain care specifically focused on transgender individuals. So the type of care that is used is puberty blocking for minors, sometimes the use of hormones as well. And then, I'm sorry, beyond hormones, even some other kinds of medical features are used. To be clear, almost none of these states, except in very, very limited circumstances, and it certainly was true in Arkansas, we did not at all, none of these states were really doing surgeries on anybody under the age of 18. Arkansas has never done surgeries for transgender youths, and most other states, most other institutions and states were not either. This is medical response. This is a medical response that using medicines, and all of it is reversible at a later time if necessary. So I'm asked, why is the Texas one not there? Because Texas actually didn't pass a law exactly. What happened was the state governor, and actually that'll come up a little bit later in the thing, but the state governor actually made an executive order. So I'll explain that a little bit in a second. So Arkansas's law, I mean, it's obviously much longer than this, but here are some excerpts from Arkansas's law, right? A physician or other healthcare professional shall not provide gender transition procedures to any individual under the age of 18. A physician or other healthcare professional shall not refer any individual under the 18 years of age to any healthcare professional for transgender transition procedures. So what is a transgender, right? The way laws work, you can read the substance of the law, but the substance of the law is going to refer back to terms that hopefully are defined in the law. If they're not, then it gets even more wild. But you have to go then to the definitional section of the law to see, and there's definition of gender transition procedures. It means to alter or remove physical or anatomical characteristics, right? That's the surgical stuff. But it also means to instill or create physiological or anatomical characteristics that resemble a sex different from an individual's biological sex, including without limitation medical services that provide puberty blocking drugs, cross-sex hormones, or other mechanisms to promote the development of feminizing or masculizing features in the opposite biological sex or genital or non-genital gender reassignment surgery. Okay, so it's kind of the whole panoply of gender affirming care is off. The only thing not listed here is counseling and therapy. So that's the one thing there. So I wish the statement, I wish legislators would listen to scientists and experts. Well, we've learned in the COVID timeframe that that's a wish that unfortunately rarely comes true. So as I said, somewhere like Texas went the other way. They couldn't pass the law. They tried, and they couldn't pass the law. So what the governor and attorney general in the state of Texas did was they decided that they would pass an executive order saying that the law on child maltreatment should be read such that gender affirming measures would count as maltreatment of the child. And so anybody who provided transgender care in the state of Texas could be prosecuted for endangerment of a child. And that was their approach. Now, a judge has blocked that temporarily, but that's just going back and forth with the courts. So who knows where that will ultimately come out. In fact, to be fair, the SAFE Act in Arkansas is actually blocked by a court right now too, though there's belief that sometime this summer the court will probably drop their opposition and it will actually come into effect. The general effect of this, of course, has been that gender clinics at children's hospitals and at other hospitals that see children have closed down. They've closed down in Texas. They've been limited here in Arkansas only to children who are already being seen, but they're not taking new patients. And this is being seen across the country in all of these places where such laws are being created or even proposed. Like I said, in Texas, in fact, they closed down in Dallas, had probably one of the premier gender clinics in the country for children. And they closed down even before the governor had made his statement because they saw the writing on the wall and decided they needed to close down. What's interesting about this, of course, is that turns out that if you do a poll of adults around the country, they may be opposed to the idea of transgender accommodations or anything like that, but they are more opposed to passing laws that would require these kinds of that would restrict these kinds of actions. And I suspect part of the reason for that is that those who are libertarian or conservative tend to oppose government intervention in general. So the opposition is to government intervention, even though they hold this idea of these of transgender individuals, of transgender category and conceptions being problematic. So just that's an interesting, I think that's an interesting fact that somehow doesn't play out when it comes time for these laws to be proposed and passed. That is, they are still being passed, even though the claim is your own constituency who voted you into office wouldn't want you to pass those laws. All right, so that's, is there any stipulation in the SAFE Act to allow care to continue for patients that are already, no, there is not. Nope. If the SAFE Act comes into play, done and done. I mean, medicine alone would, the medical professionals alone would certainly by their own codes of ethics from their own professional societies would and standards of care would do a taper or anything like that that might be necessary if that's what the child and parents wanted to taper down. But no, there is no provision to continue such treatments if the law comes into effect. If the law comes into effect, continuing such treatment would be just as illegal as starting treatments. All right, so that's the legal landscape in which things are now occurring. Now I want to talk a little bit about medicine itself, because some people that are passing these laws would argue in part, and frankly, some people would pass them, some people who are not passing these laws but work in medicine might argue in part that part of the problem is transgender identity and what follows from that is not a medical issue. It's not something for medicine to be worried about, right? It may have all sorts of implications for the individual, but they're not medical implications. Some have argued. So, what does medicine address? Well, some would say medicine addresses well-being. Very broad idea, right? And so if that's true, transgender would fall under this. But not everybody thinks well-being is quite the way to describe medicine qua medicine, as medicine is. It may address well-being, but only as an aspect of it, because otherwise self-help books and that kind of work would be considered medical interventions or medical care. Well, guess what? We don't think that. So that makes that a problem. We'll come back to some of the legal questions you're popping up here a little bit later, because I don't want to step backwards now that I'm in here, but I do see it. All right, next, some argue that it is living healthily. That is, medicine addresses what it means to live healthily, not just well-being, but healthily. And health is what falls under the umbrella of medicine. But it opens the question, raises the question, what do we mean by health? And how do we talk about health in such a way that it uniquely falls under this umbrella, where people who are tasked with doing medical care are tasked with doing that, working on that. And that can be a difficult question. Health isn't obviously just well-being. If it were, then we'd be back up at the the other category. It seems narrower than that, but broader than simply curing illness or something, right? But others would say it's exactly the problem with the concept of health being kind of nebulous and hard to pin down, that we should limit the umbrella of medicine to illness and injury. That the whole point of health of medicine is to deal with illness and injury. But that seems problematic because we throw things like OBGYN under there. And pregnancy isn't an illness. It's not an injury. So why is it under the umbrella of medicine? Should it not be, or are we mischaracterizing what it means? Right, and then questions of aesthetic changes and Botox, right? So you cleverly anticipate the next bullet point, right? Illness, injury, and prevention thereof might be a broader way of thinking about that. And so OB could fall under it as prevention because pregnancy does have significant physiologic effect on you, which could end up in illness or injury. So OB falls under that as prevention thereof. But then what about psychiatry, cosmetic surgery? Are psychological conditions an illness? Are they an injury? Are they about preventative health? And then cosmetic surgery or any sorts of cosmetic medicine. Is that medicine? Does that fall under the umbrella? So these are hard to figure out. That is, what is the scope of medicine? What falls under its umbrella? And that leads, of course, to how should we think about transgender healthcare? If we were to go with the more restrictive definitions, I'm not saying we should, let me be really clear. I'm just kind of carrying through a thought experiment. If we went with the more restrictive definitions of health, of medicine, as say illness and injury or illness, injury, and prevention thereof, is transgender identity an illness? Is it an injury? Is it something to be prevented? If it's an illness, is it a physiologic illness? Is it a psychological one? Is it existential? I mean, I think if we were to characterize it in an illness, and I wouldn't, but I think if you would, the closest one might be an existential illness in terms of an existential concern, right? Who am I and what does it mean to be me? It might be that, but again, we wouldn't necessarily say that existential concerns and crises fall under medicine per se. If anything, philosophers might have a better say of that. And you might then turn around and say, well, from the kind of more preventative side, maybe transgender healthcare falls under the umbrella of medicine, again, under this restrictive consideration of medicine. Under this restrictive consideration of medicine, maybe it falls under there because it can result in illness or injury. And it most certainly does that. I mean, that is, it has the possibility of leading of transgender identity in our culture, leading to all sorts of other kinds of healthcare concerns because people are struggling to live an identity that this society is not fully has not fully embraced, right? So we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but this is part of that challenge. And the reason I want to use the more restrictive one is because I think people who want to claim that transgender care doesn't fall within the umbrella of medicine have a fairly restrictive notion of medicine. And so I'm trying to tease out, is it possible then that even with this restricted notion to see if transgender care should fall under the umbrella? And I would say, even with that restrictive notion, there's a way to see transgender care as falling within the scope of medicine and not outside of it. With broader concepts of medicine, like living healthily, I think it clearly falls under the scope of medicine. But with this more restrictive one, does it? Again, I think it absolutely could, right? And so can and should healthcare help transgender patients live healthily, deal with the possibility of future illness and injury, and again, in a broader sense, frankly, the reason I bring in live healthily is because in one of my early books, I argued that that's what medicine is really about. I think it clearly does, and transgender care does fall under the umbrella of medicine, so that we can't say the reason that we're restricting, using laws to restrict medical interventions and medical responses to transgender identity is wrong, is because it really isn't a medical problem, and medicine is reaching beyond its own scope and authority to do these kinds of things. I actually would argue that's just false. And in fact, I'm not the only one who would argue this. Professional societies across the board have done this, from child and adolescent psychiatry to the American Academy of Pediatrics to Pediatric Endocrine Society. All of these places and more have identified transgender care as falling within the scope of reasonable medical practice. And what's all the more concerning is by not providing medical care. By not providing medical care, you then leave these children to deal with these very challenging issues at a very challenging part of life. Look, we've all grown up through our teens and moving through our teens. That's a hard time of life, regardless of what kinds of life you're trying to lead, because you're trying to figure out what it means to live a life at a very early part of your life. So that becomes very difficult. And it's heightened when you're trying to figure out what kind of life you want to live, seems to be thwarted by the culture in which you find yourself, right? So we find that there are high rates of depression, anxiety, self-harm, and suicidality in teens who, in transgender teens, right? We also know that gender-affirming care is helpful in reducing the rates of depression, anxiety, and self-harm and suicidality in these kids. So we know we can show the causal correspondence, or at least correspondence, if not straight causality, at least correspondence between providing gender-affirming care and better mental health outcomes for these kids. So it says, one of the articles mentioned that some people think transgender care should be addressed socially rather than medically. What ideas have been presented? I don't know. I'll be honest. I don't know exactly what that eventuates as, right? As being addressed socially. I think what I would say is, I don't know why we have to say either or here. I agree that it needs to be identified socially, and our culture needs to come up with ways of being able to embrace these different identities that people have for themselves and in their lives. And so there are social things that need to happen. The culture needs to change. We need to be willing to have bathrooms that allow people to use the bathroom of their choice, and so on and so forth. Those are the kinds of social things, but that isn't, to my mind, an absence of a medical response. It should go hand in hand with the medical response. So talking about the regret and wish not to, we're going to get to that in just a minute. So another nice anticipation on that issue. So what about the clinical side of things? I want to get this out of the way right now, that any individual practitioner, as a practitioner, both laws and licensure allow an individual practitioner to opt out. Right? That's not just true of transgender care. That's true of any sort of medical care. Laws and licensure lets an individual practitioner say, I'm not doing that. And that's what we'll call professional autonomy. They have the ability to make decisions for themselves as a professional what they want to do. Of course, I'd say, yeah, let's not do that. As a moral statement, I would say that. I'm not saying they don't have the right, and I'm not going to force them to do something. They do have the right not to, but I would argue they still should. Patients need the expertise of medical professionals and mental health professionals. They need that expertise that those professionals have that, frankly, somebody like me with a degree in philosophy doesn't have. So there's not a lot I can do there. It's worth noting that the nature of medical relationships, over our decades of discussion about such things, the idea is to do the right healing action for the particular patient in front of you. That we want to help patients connect with their communities and their everydayness so that they can live the lives of everydayness. Illness, phenomenologically, that is by way of experience. Illness is experienced as a break with everydayness. I get the flu and the things I do every day have changed. And because they've changed in a way that are challenging to me, I experience myself as ill. If flus were just viruses running around in you that you never experienced, you wouldn't say you were ill, even though you had the flu inside you. The experience of the flu keeping you from doing your everydayness, from being part of the world as you understand it, it is what makes it an illness. And so part of medicine's job is to help people reconnect with that everydayness. And medical relationships rely on trust. So at the clinical level, we have to demonstrate that we are trustworthy, that we're worthy of the trust that patients put in us. We do that through care, through truth-telling, confidentiality, fidelity. That's how we do it. And you can see, given these kinds of ethical norms and values, it's important in transgender case that we stay with these patients and not abandon them. Because the goals of medicine aren't cure. We're not trying to cure these children. We are trying to help them live healthily, as I said before. And that's a key component to what medical care is all about. Forgive me, I see things coming up in the chat, and we'll get to those a little bit later. It's hard to read those and continue to talk, so I will get to some of that. I do want to get then to the question of what some people call desistance. That is the idea that the identity, transgender identity, doesn't persist into the future as strongly as we think it does. And this has become known as desistance. So we have to see that healing action is right. That the normative account says that healing action, gender affirming care aren't the same thing. So what do we think about desistance? So I call it the specter of desistance. It's this kind of triangulation of things. Desistance, there's no one definition in the literature on this, but roughly speaking, it's children who don't persist in an interest to transition. And there are some studies, here are 3 of them, and you have one of these, the Steensma piece, or a Steensma piece is in your readings. The idea of desistance here is that upwards of 80% of children don't persist in their interest to transition. That's the That's been the traditional number that's come out of this kind of research. However, there have been folks, and these are just two, but there's actually been quite a number of folks who have gone after this research to show why it is not good research, that it actually fails in methodology and in its interpretation of its results and conclusions. Now, of course, let's be clear, you might say the academic politics of all this is that's how this works. Somebody puts out research and findings, and other people either review those findings and accept them, or review the findings and don't accept them and then give reasons why we shouldn't. So this is a standard academic back and forth. Having said that, if you read the stuff questioning the research, it's pretty darn strong arguments about why this research fails and why the number 80% has really been kind of made up out of these things and has been perpetuated mistakenly through this whole process. And so some people argue that really the problem is not just the desistance as an issue. It's more that we're even talking about desistance rather than looking at supporting children as they grow. The whole point of not having done surgery to children at the age of 11 who claim that they want to transition is that we give them the time to live out their experiences and see what happens as they get older, until they reach an age where they, at least legally, if not neurobiologically, at least legally can make that decision for themselves at the age of 18 or later. And so the argument is, don't worry so much about desistance and whether it persists. That will take care of itself. What we do is start with the child as they're growing and supporting them as they grow, so that they know they're supported in the way they're experiencing the world as they're experiencing it. And so it's not, and to that extent, then if 50, 20, 80, whatever percent do decide that they don't want to transition, we can stop, move back, and let them move on with the lives that they want to lead. The other thing about it is, even if it is 80%, even if that is a true number that meets with the reality of the universe that we live in, that still would leave 20% of these children without any care if we said, no, because this number is so high, we shouldn't do anything. And that's troubling as well. Of course, it's allowing statistics as quote unquote facts to be valued in a particular way that devalues the experience of others. Right? So again, what constitutes these treatments? We've talked a little bit about this. Medical responses, puberty blocking, gender-affirming hormones, there's mental health responses, counseling, and the like. Social responses, in other words, using desired names and pronouns, and how we work through that. There are, of course, surgical responses. Again, typically, and most ethicists also agree with this, typically, we would push those down the line until someone's 18 and able to make that decision legally for themselves. They hit the age of majority at that time. So what do we do if there's conflicts between the parents and the child, right? That where the child wants to go one way and parents want to go another. Typically, this would be children who are saying they resonate with transgender identity. They may want to start transitioning puberty suppression or something like that, versus parents who say, no way, that's not happening. We have to recognize a few things. Parental authority is socially and legally recognized for anyone under the age of 18. Parents have that authority. And we grant them in our society the ability to make those kinds of decisions. But others have argued that because of this being an identity question, not as, say, a question of vaccine, childhood vaccination or repairing a broken arm, but this is actually an identity question, that children's authority should be stronger than we typically would give it in medicine. It would be closer to the authority that we sometimes grant minors when it comes to STIs, STDs, and the care around those issues. It's a hard one to bring because, again, yes, it's an identity issue, but also the concept of identity and the development of the child psychologically, socially, and cognitively are at such a stage that that's a challenging place to give authority at any time, whether it's for these issues or not. So here's what I would say, and this will be my last slide. Well, yes, last substantive slide. Gender is a substantive and not fundamental aspect of the self. And the self is a situated and mutable aspect of human beings. So as such, gender is not something fixed, though certainly affected by biology and genetics or nature, and may demand attention and consideration throughout lifespan. Children are early developing selves, physiologically, psychologically, socially, and cognitively. As such, they will experience their developing selves and are working on understanding who they are becoming. Further, they may lack the ability to act as fully autonomous individuals with regards to transgender care issues. Parents are tasked with helping their children become the best version of themselves by helping author their life stories. As such, they are entitled to operate within their own values as parents, but must listen to the developing interests and values of their children, providing support for those experiences, for the child's experiences. Healthcare providers are under the ethical norm of helping persons live healthily, using means at their disposal of medicine to do so. As such, they should stand at the ready to provide or refer to those who can provide gender-affirming care where it is appropriate. The state should recognize parental authority while also protecting vulnerable individuals from undue and identifiable harm. As such, it should allow families to work through conflicts about starting medical interventions in transgender care, but also step in to protect children whose families turn abusive towards transgender children. Further, the state should not interfere with access to gender-affirming care. And to be honest, I'm still thinking about that first line, allowing families to work through conflicts. That is, I'm still trying to figure out all the arguments and how I would weigh the arguments for allowing children a little bit more authority with regards to these issues, as opposed to just having the family just work through this on their own. This is where I stand now, but I reserve the right to change my mind on that as I think more about it. So that was a lot to talk about. Looking at the time, we've got a couple of minutes before taking our break, if I'm reading everything right. And I want to be clear that I also want to just be clear that, these state laws I think are problematic. It doesn't necessarily mean that I would support any professional who decides they're willing to break the law, so long as they know what those consequences are and they're willing to take on those consequences. I would not demand that any provider break the law in this case. That is, that they have an obligation to just ignore the law in this case, because there's a lot at stake, not just for them, but for the other patients that they care for in that. But I think by opposing the law, what I am saying is that as a society, we need to push back on our legislators and be clear that these are not the kinds of laws that we should pass. That's my own position. So.
Thank you so much, Professor Hester. That was amazing and